Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the end of our celebration of Darwin Day. And we've had a long series of things all day long, films, exhibits, and so on. And this is the main event. It's also one of the Living World lecture series. We're about to knock this off the stage. And there won't be a Living World lecture in March, although if one needs to go to something, I'm the Living World lecture in March, but it's going to be at Stony Brook, Southampton, and it's going to be on March 4th at 7:30, and I'm going to talk about the oyster problem, restoring oysters back to Long Island. But in April, we have the completion of, if anybody had asked me, what's the dream combination of science journalists? Who would you really like to have more than anybody else? I would have said, it's pretty obvious, I'd want Carl Zimmer and Andrew Revkin. And for Stony Brook's Earth Day celebration, it also will be Living World, the end of the Stony Brook Earth Week, Earth Stalk celebration on April 29th at 7:30. I'm not sure where it's going to be. I'm hoping it's going to be here, but it might be set up in the Long Center, which will be too small. We're going to have Andrew Revkin, the writer of .Earth, the blog .Earth, and surely one of the most distinguished climate change journalists in the world. So that's going to be really cool, and I'm looking forward to that as I'm looking forward, we all are, to this evening's talk. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce and have Eric Kaler, our Provost, come up and introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure today to welcome you to our Darwin Day lecture, which I guess is actually Darwin's Birthday Eve Day lecture. It's held this year in partnership with the Center for Communicating Science, the Department of Ecology and Evolution, and as you've heard, the Living World Lecture Series. We're really very, very fortunate to have with us today Charles Zimmer, who is a renowned author and science journalist. In fact, the New York Times Book Review calls him as fine a science essayist as we have. He's the author of 7 acclaimed books about biology and medicine, as well as hundreds of articles for the New York Times, Time, National Geographic, Scientific American, and many other publications. As a contributing editor to Discover, he also writes a monthly column about neuroscience and an award-winning blog called The Loon. He's served as a scientific editor for television documentaries, helped design museum exhibits, and contributed his writing to major science websites. A graduate of Yale, Carl first began writing about science at Discover, where he served for 5 years as a senior editor. He is a distinguished academic. He's won both Guggenheim and Sloan Fellowships, and his articles have earned a number of awards. In 2007, he won the National Academy's Communication Award and has been recognized with the AAAS Science Journalism Award twice, in 2009 for large circulation newspapers and in 2004 for online journalism. His 2004 book, Soul Made Flesh, A History of Neurology, which I know for a fact that at least one person in the audience has a recently autographed copy, and if you want some others, I know he'll oblige. But this book was named one of the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times Book Review. His latest book, Microcosm, was a finalist for the 2008 Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Currently, Carl's a lecturer at Yale University, where he teaches science writing and a visiting scholar at NYU. In honor of the life and work of Charles Darwin, and as we celebrate his birthday and those who continue his journey, this evening's lecture, entitled Darwin, From Birth to Death, will discuss the work of one of Darwin's great followers, the late Stony Brook University biologist George Williams. We're honored to have Carl speak here on this important and timely topic, and please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for coming. Just so you know, this is not the concert that's happening in the other room. So if you're waiting for me to break out into dance and song, I'm going to have to disappoint you. What we are here for today is, in fact, to celebrate Darwin's birthday, which is tomorrow. He is going to be turning 202. And later this year, the Origin of Species will have its own birthday. It will be turning 152. And a good place to actually talk about the legacy of Charles Darwin and this book is to take a look at it and see what isn't in there. To go to the end of the book and look at what he talks about in terms of the future of evolution. Because Darwin was not claiming that with his book he was wrapping everything up. In fact, Darwin recognized very well that what he was doing was he was opening up a new field of science. He was raising a lot more questions than he could answer, and that's how good science works. So one of the things... Yes, if you can't see, could we get the lights dim so people can read this? Thank you. Near the end of the book, for example, is that better? A little more, please. Yeah, maybe you could turn the house lights down, please. You guys let me know when it's good, okay? All right, we have satisfaction. Excellent. Okay, so now you can read with me. So this is in just like in the last page of The Origin of Species. Darwin says, when the views entertained in this volume on the origin of species, or when analogous views are generally admitted, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history. And by natural history, he meant lots of different things. He meant paleontology. He even actually had psychology in mind and our own species. He said, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Now, if you look at that last page in The Origin of Species, you actually discover that there's something kind of big that's missing. In terms of different fields of science, there's one field that just is not there. It doesn't say anything about medicine. Now, today, that's kind of mind-blowing. If you take a look at the budgets for the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, I just looked this up. National Science Foundation gets about $7 billion a year. The National Institutes of Health gets $31 billion a year for research. And yet, Darwin didn't say anything about it. Now, it's always interesting to speculate why Darwin didn't do things. It's always interesting to play these kind of historical games. I have one theory, which is that he really didn't think much of medicine. Darwin was really sick for a lot of his life. And actually, if you go to Wikipedia, you can actually find a page called Charles Darwin's Health. And it's really good, because it really distills it all. So for 40 years, Darwin suffered intermittently from various combinations of symptoms such as malaise, vertigo, dizziness, muscle spasms, tremors, vomiting, cramps, colics, bloating, nocturnal intestinal gas, headaches, alterations of vision, severe tiredness, nervous exhaustion, dyspnea, skin problems such as blisters all over the scalp, eczema, crying, anxiety, sensations of impending death, it's no big surprise, loss of consciousness, fainting, tachycardia, where your heart's beating like crazy, insomnia, tinnitus, and here's another big surprise, depression. There are all sorts of theories about why Darwin felt so lousy for so much of his life. When he would feel lousy, he would go try to get medical help, and it didn't do that much good for him. And he tried all sorts of strange sorts of cures. There was something called the water cure, the water treatment, where you would basically like be in a hot sauna and then get splashed with cold water and back and forth, and this would go on and on for days. He apparently rigged up electric belts to give himself little shocks. He took laudanum and bismuth and all sorts of things, and nothing really helped. So maybe that had something to do with him not really thinking that that evolution would really help much in terms of medicine. Or maybe it's possible that he didn't really himself recognize the connection, that it would be up to later scientists to see that really there was one. So that's actually changed, and the change is happening right now. So 152 years after the origin of species, we can see it. And one of the places where we can see it is in this book. This is the Oxford Textbook of Medicine, which is a gigantic desk reference. It's one of these standard references for medicine, and every few years they come out with a new edition. And the new edition just came out, and this is the cover, and right at the beginning, they have a section now called Evolution, the Most Basic Science of Medicine, which is co-authored by Randolph Nesse, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Michigan, and Richard Dawkins, who was until recently at Oxford University. So this is just one of many signs that there's a new kind of science that's really emerging. And sometimes people call it Darwinian medicine, sometimes they call it evolutionary medicine. And there are a lot of people who are responsible for this actually coming about. But if there was one person who really laid the groundwork and really made this possible, I would say it would be George Williams. George Williams came here to Stony Brook in 1960. He passed away last year. And in that intervening time, he became one of the really towering figures in modern evolutionary biology in carrying forward Darwin's legacy and addressing some of the things that Darwin himself had not been able to. So what I'd like to do tonight to celebrate Darwin Day is to talk about this particular man and how he filled in this particular hole in the origin of species. So in order for me to explain why George Williams did such important work, I got to jump back and talk again about Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin really started to become a naturalist, a real practicing naturalist in his early 20s when he took a 5-year voyage around the world on the Beagle, which is this ship here. He was sort of the unofficial naturalist on the ship, and as they went from port to port, he would explore the surrounding area, and he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing using the ideas, the books that he had been reading back home in England. And the longer that he traveled and the more that he thought, the less satisfied he became with a lot of the most popular ideas. For example, that each individual species had been specially created in its own particular place. He would go to South America and he would see fossils of gigantic rodents that looked a lot like the rodents that were alive there at the time. And so the wheel started to turn. He starts to think, well, maybe these are related. Maybe we're looking at ancestors and descendants. So when Darwin came home, he started trying to sort all this out. And he had some notebooks where he would scribble down his ideas. He was working very hard, publishing books on all the stuff that he had collected in his trip around the world. But on the side, he had this little project, which was basically reinventing biology. So there were two main things that I want to mention that Darwin developed. And these are just the key things for talking about George Williams tonight. So the first is Darwin's idea that life actually branches like a tree. This is actually a drawing that he did in one of his notebooks. And I don't know if you can see, but in the very upper left-hand corner, he writes, "I think." This is when he's just starting to work this out. Maybe species were not actually just created suddenly out of nothing. Maybe species are related to each other the way that you are related to your cousin. You share a common ancestor with your cousin, your grandparents. Well, maybe species had common ancestors as well. And over time, they diverged and split apart and took on different appearances. So what drove that splitting? Darwin came up with a couple of different ideas, one of which, the most powerful of which, was natural selection. So I just want to give you a real simple kind of run through with natural selection. Let's say you've got a population of oysters, for example. And some of the oysters are really good at resisting salty water and some are not so good. And maybe you could just make those different colors represent the variations in resisting salt water. Now, some of them are going to survive and some aren't. So let's say that the ones that can resist salt better are able to survive and reproduce and the others aren't. Well, if they're carrying that in their genes, they're going to pass their genes on to their descendants. And so the next generation is going to be a bit more like them. There's still going to be variation, but the population is shifting a little. And then you get the whole process happening again and again, until eventually, sorry, that corner is a little dark. Eventually what happens is that you would get a population that looks quite different from the way it did originally. So this could be one way that those branches could separate from each other. So in the century or so after Darwin published The Origin of Species, his view of life really came to dominate biology. And obviously, Darwin didn't know about DNA, he didn't even know about genes, but actually, as those things were discovered, they allowed biologists to actually see natural selection and the other things that Darwin was writing about happening at the level of molecules. So it was a real triumph for Darwin's view in a lot of ways. And there was another thing that was starting to happen in the mid-1900s when people would be thinking about Darwin's ideas. So everything basically started to look like an adaptation to a lot of scientists. So they would look around and say, well, this is an adaptation, that's an adaptation, and it must have been the result of natural selection. So why did that happen? And a lot of the time they would say, oh, it must have happened because it was good for the group, that it helped a group of animals survive. There were a lot of behaviors that animals would have. Maybe they would cooperate with each other. And so scientists say, oh, it's good for the group. This kind of reasoning actually even extended to why there's death. So why do animals get old and die? I mean, your cat at home, why doesn't your cat just keep on being a young, sprightly kitten until eventually it gets hit by a car or something like that? I mean, why does your cat get old and then one day just not wake up? Why? Well, in the mid-1900s, there were a lot of scientists who were talking about an idea of what sometimes was called beneficial death. So let's say you got a big herd, and the herd's all eating grass as fast as they can, and they're having calves. Now, if that herd, if they were basically immortal, you just have more and more and more calves, right? And they would grow up and they'd be adults too, and eventually the herd would just get so huge that they would just strip bare their habitat, and then they'd all starve. So it was good for the group, it's good for the herd, for the older ones to die. So some scientists would say, well, natural selection must have produced death because it was beneficial for the whole group. And this is where George Williams comes in. This drawing actually just appeared in the American Naturalist. As I understand it, it was a drawing done by someone after hearing a talk he gave. And I do like this picture very much. George Williams, after serving World War II, went on to get his PhD. And his specialty was fish. So I guess after giving a talk about fish biology, someone decided to put his head on the body of an eel. But I sort of like this sort of kind of peaceful, thoughtful smile as he's sort of swimming along. I met him once, and this is kind of how he struck me. And from what I hear from people who knew him, this is kind of a good caricature of him. In any case, in the late 1950s, Williams was at the University of Chicago. He was a postdoctoral researcher, and there was a lecture that he went to given by one Professor Emerson, in which Professor Emerson was talking about beneficial death. Animals die because it's good for the group. And later he wrote this. He said, "My reaction was that if Emerson's presentation was acceptable biology, I would prefer another calling." When I asked him about it a few years ago, he just said, "I just thought this was completely absurd." And it really got Williams to thinking about what natural selection is. And not only that, but how do you think about natural selection? How do you study it as a scientist? And what he argued was that there are a lot of opportunities to mess it up. So I'll give you one example that Williams offered. So imagine a fox likes to go to a hen house to go grab chickens. And it starts to snow, and a lot of snow piles up. And the fox goes back to the chicken coop and grabs the chicken and takes it home and takes the same path back. And then goes the next morning, grabs another chicken and goes back. After a while, that fox will have plowed a nice little path to the chicken coop. Now, does that mean that the fox's legs evolved to be snowplows? Did natural selection favor those kinds of legs because they're good at plowing snow? Well, no, of course not. That's just sort of a side effect. I mean, legs evolved because they helped animals move around on land, and so animals actually go way back to when fish had fins. There were some fish that started adapting to land, and the individuals who had legs of a certain shape could move further and more efficiently, and after a while you have full-blown legs. That's the right kind of level to talk about natural selection. And so Williams thought that a lot of this talk about things that are good for the group, we're talking about natural selection at the wrong level. It's not that he didn't believe that necessarily that you couldn't have what was called group selection, but he just thought a lot of the things that people throw around were just wrong. So, for example, you could have a school of fish, and the fish school seems to move around like a superorganism. It's almost like it's got a mind of its own. I don't know if you've ever seen movies of fish schools. It's really mind-blowing. But Williams argued that kind of collective behavior could have just evolved from individual fish just, essentially saying to themselves, I better get in the middle of this crowd because that's the safe place. And so that collective kind of selfishness would create the behavior of a fish school. So Williams put all of these ideas into an incredibly influential book called Adaptation and Natural Selection. And so there he laid out sort of the basic logic that I'm telling you, obviously in far more detail and much more deeply reasoned. But one of the things he talked about was this idea I was telling you about beneficial death. And he explained why he thought that it was kind of absurd. One reason it's absurd is just that there's just no way for that kind of adaptation to happen. Because if you think about it, I mean, you're going to have, let's say, that herd of wildebeest. Maybe you have this wildebeest over here that's going to live to be 25, and this wildebeest is only going to live to be 20, because they have slightly different genes. Well, that wildebeest, all other things being equal, might be able to have more calves and have more offspring and pass on those longevity genes, whatever they are, to its offspring. And so then the next generation, the wildebeest are going to be longer and longer lived. And basically, if you, as an individual wildebeest, are going to die sooner, you're going to lose in that competition. That's just natural selection. So, in this book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, Williams writes this passage. He says, walking home from the lecture with my wife Doris, who is with us tonight, I regaled her with my unhappiness about the lecture and proposed the obvious idea that selection among individuals in any population would be biased in favor of the young, as long as the likelihood of living to age X was greater than to age X plus 1. Now, it sounds really simple, but it's an incredible insight. It's deceptively simple. And so I have to just sort of take you through it step by step to just see how clever this was. So let's just imagine there's this fish, okay? We'll call it the Williams eel, okay? And so this is a fish that never gets old. It does not know death. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't get eaten by bigger fish. So there are bigger fish going around, and every now and then an eel gets killed. Okay, so that means that the older that an eel gets, the more likely it is that it's going to die. So if you look at the whole population, you look at it over time, you're going to see that a smaller and smaller percentage of the fish from any given age are alive. So that's what Williams was talking about. You've got this curve. So there are more fish that are young than are old. So what that means is that if you look at the population, most of the eels had young parents, because there weren't that many old parents around. And that's actually a big deal. If there's a mutation that helps a young eel, it's going to have a big effect because there's so many young eels around. And if a young eel passes on this beneficial mutation to its offspring that helps them in their youth, they're going to have more kids too. So this little chart here, that little arrow shows like a beneficial mutation that has a big effect. It's going to spread really far in the population. Now, what happens if that mutation happens, but it only affects you when you're old? It doesn't matter very much because there aren't very, if you're an eel, chances are you're never going to live that long to enjoy that benefit. So that's not going to have a big effect. The flip side of this is true too. So a lot of mutations are harmful. That's why a lot of genetic disorders are caused by mutations. So if there's a mutation that makes you really sick when you're young, that's going to have a big effect because it's going to kill off a lot of the eels that carry it. So it's not going to be able to spread to the population. Like if there's a harmful mutation that only harms eels when they're old, probably doesn't matter that much because, like I said, a lot of the eels would be dead by then. So now Williams had his readers imagine something else. Now, the fact is that when you think about a gene, sometimes you'll read about, oh, this is an alcoholism gene, or this is a schizophrenia gene, as if somehow a gene did one thing. Actually, genes do lots of different things. One gene might help to build a pattern of your arms and also build a pattern of your brain when you're developing. Same gene. So genes do lots of different things, and that's actually called pleiotropy. This is the only jargon I'm going to throw at you tonight. Pleiotropy. Actually, there's one more piece of jargon. Antagonistic pleiotropy, okay? So what this is one gene where it has a good effect in one way and a bad effect in another way. That's it. So Williams said, hey, what if there's a gene that's really beneficial when you're young, but then later it has a different effect that's bad? Well, if the good is bigger than the bad, it's still kind of a net positive. And what that means is that that animals could pick up these mutations over time. Natural selection would spread these mutations around. In other words, natural selection itself could pile up a lot of harmful mutations, which seems kind of weird. It seems like that shouldn't be how it works. But Williams observed that it did. And what this means is that you could have a whole bunch of really beneficial genes that help you to survive and to reproduce while you were young, but these same genes that helped you in your youth would make you sick in old age. In fact, they're the cause of old age. And actually, the steeper that curve, so if there are like a lot of predators around, that means that it's even less likely you're going to be around when you're old. So that means that it matters even more that you have good mutations when you're young, and it matters even less what happens to you when you get old. So the steeper that curve gets, the stronger the selection. So this was the idea, and it actually took a while to figure out ways to test it. But there was one prediction that he made that I wanted to talk about tonight. Basically, like, if there are low adult death rates in a group of animals, if they're not getting eaten by a lot of predators, you'll expect that they're going to age more slowly because there are more old animals around. So Stephen Austad, who's now at the University of Texas, in the 1980s and then into the 1990s, he wanted to try to test this idea, and he had a great way to do it. What he could do was he could use what he's actually holding there, an opossum. He studied opossums, and he studied them in two different populations, two different places, and he was going to compare them to each other. So one was the island there, Sapelo Island, which is off the coast of Georgia. And then there was another site, which was upriver on the border of South Carolina and Georgia. So why was he choosing these two places and these animals to test Williams's idea? Well, they experienced different kinds of things. They experienced just the different kinds of conditions that Williams was talking about. So on the mainland, these poor opossums just got hammered. They were getting eaten up. 80% of the opossums were killed by predators. Okay, so this is a place where they're getting wiped out, and not many of them are going to be living, they're going to be able to survive very long. But Sapelo Island was very different. See, what happened was that a few thousand years ago, when sea levels were lower, these opossums got over to the island, and then the sea levels went up. No predators went over with them. So these opossums, they are kicking back. They have got this incredibly relaxed lifestyle, and they've had it for 5,000 years. And Austad actually says that when he went to Sapelo Island, these opossums were so unaccustomed to predators that they would sometimes take naps in the road in the daytime. I mean, you've all seen a possum, just opossums in any large area with predators, they're always scurrying around, they're always terrified, they're always like snarling at you. These opossums were like, hey, how's it going? So Austad said, hey, so here we have a case. Huge, massive predation and mortality on the mainland, and a possum paradise on Sapelo Island. No predators. They are not going to get killed off So he said, let me check out how long these animals live. This took a while. Opossums typically live between 1 to 2, maybe 3 years. So it takes a while to build up this kind of data set. So he wanted to say, okay, how long do they live? When do they have their first offspring? All these different things. And this is just a few of the pieces of data that he collected. So the island possums, they're living over 4 months longer than the ones on the mainland. Now you're saying, 4 months, whatever, who cares? I mean, that's what I'll get from smoking a couple cigarettes, right? Well, just look at the percentages here. I mean, this is 20%. This is like saying, would you like to live to age 80 or age 100? That's the kind of difference for these animals as this was. And this was a genetic difference. This is like generation in, generation out, they were living longer. And the maximum they would live would be much longer too. They gave birth later the first time, and they actually had smaller litters. But their young would tend to live longer. Were more likely to survive than the ones on the mainland. And just there are a couple of really fascinating features here. So the death rate was slower. So in this graph, this is up on that axis, that's the proportion that are dying. So by the time you get to 28 months on the mainland, they're all gone. But you can see that the death rate's much slower on Sapelo Island. This is just after just a few thousand years of evolution. And it wasn't just that they were dying, but they were aging more gracefully. I also had actually noticed this, that when he would study the mainland opossums, after maybe a year and a half, they started getting really kind of ratty and just kind of falling apart. He wanted to find kind of a more objective way to measure that. So what he did was he looked at their tendons, and he would pull on the fibers to see how springy they were, and see how long it took him to pull them so they would snap. Because as you get older, your collagen starts to become damaged. That's why we get wrinkles and our skin sags a little, and we're not quite as good at running or what have you. A lot of it has to do with damage to the collagen. Well, the opossums on this island, their tendons were aging slower. So these opossums, a really old opossum on the island had the tendons of a very young opossum on the mainland. So they had sort of found they found the fountain of youth on Sapelo Island. Now, there have been a lot of other studies on animals, and the story gets more and more complex. There may be situations where other factors come into play. But this idea of antagonistic pleiotropy, sorry to throw that at you again, has really become a very important part of how scientists think about why there is death, why animals die. So Williams went on to do a number of different lines of research. He asked a lot of equally simple yet profound questions, like why animals have sex, or why there is altruism. Each one of those would really deserve a whole evening of discussion on their own. When you think about, for example, the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, one of the most popular books ever about evolution since The Origin of Species, that really builds on Williams's work. Dawkins, when Williams died, called him one of the most important biologists of my time. So we could talk about all those things, but there really isn't enough time because Williams did so many things. So the one thing I just want to talk about is how Williams went to take the ideas I just told you about and use them to start laying the groundwork for what we call evolutionary medicine. This is a book that he published with Randolph Nesse called Why We Get Sick, where they really lay out a lot of their basic ideas. Now, when people think about medicine and evolution, a lot of times what they think about are bacteria. And that's fine. That's good. I mean, because bacteria and viruses, they're constantly evolving. That is one of the reasons why antibiotic resistance is such a huge problem today. Because we throw these weapons at bacteria, and they evolve resistance very quickly. And Darwin, unfortunately, he knew very well the effects of this kind of sickness. His daughter, Anne Darwin, died probably of scarlet fever at age 10, I believe. But Darwin himself, he actually lived to a ripe old age. He died at about age 73. And so that was actually older than average for his time. But he was actually living in a real kind of revolution of human longevity. After our lifespan being around 35, 40 years for thousands of years, all of a sudden, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, to new supplies of food and so on, in Europe and the United States, the lifespan shot up. So now all of a sudden, people were living into these sort of golden years, and we're starting to deal with a lot of diseases, such as cancer and Alzheimer's disease and heart disease. Now, George Williams and Nesse argued that actually these sorts of diseases, it makes sense to think about them in terms of evolution as well. Now, how could that be? I mean, it's not like you have some bacteria that's evolving and then causing you Alzheimer's or heart disease. How could that be? Well, it just gets back to what I was telling you about. So Williams very much felt that what's true for animals is true for us. I mean, we are animals. We have animal biology. We are subject to the same kinds of evolutionary processes that animals are. So this is a graph that is just another curve showing you survivorship. The bottom one is chimpanzees, but then the top ones are various human groups where these are like hunter-gatherers, where they don't have much access to medicine. What this is showing you is kind of like what human biology is like without medicine kind of fuzzying the picture too much. So you have this kind of steady curve. I mean, biologically, we live longer than chimpanzees. And this is another curve to show you, which is the mortality rate. So kids, and again, chimpanzees chimpanzees are at the top because they have a higher mortality rate, and the humans are at the bottom. And you can see that after a very high childhood mortality rate, it drops down, gets very low, and then starts to rise up again after middle age, and then keeps climbing. So this curve reflects something about our biology, and we've seen this curve before. So the question is our getting old and our being more likely to die as we get older, is that this antagonistic pleiotropy? I'm trouble pronouncing it myself. Well, this was a question that George Williams himself was fascinated by. And so when he was in his 50s, he thought, okay, I'm getting old. I would like to chart my own decline. This was a naturalist par excellence. He would make himself the object of his own study, even studying his own decline. And then, so he would go to a track here in Stony Brook, and he would run. And he would time himself. How long did it take him to run? I believe it was a mile. I'd have to double check on that. But, oh, I'm sorry. Here it says, a male, this is actually a paper this is kind of funny. This is a paper he delivered when he won the Crawford Prize, which is basically considered the Nobel Prize for all the biology that's not eligible for the Nobel Prize. And he showed everybody his track performance. And it says here, figure 1, age-related decline in speed of a male human subject running a course of about 1,700 meters. A male human subject being, of course, himself. And he was getting slower. I mean, he was still healthy, but he was getting slower. And as I'm getting older, I can sympathize with that. And, as after your 20s, it's all downhill, and that hill gets steeper and steeper, I'm afraid. So now, Williams was studying this really from kind of a naturalist perspective, and so he was making observations on himself, and he was thinking very theoretically. But this idea has really taken medicine by storm. And so if you go look at the research that cancer biologists are doing or other medical researchers, they're using this concept, and it's helping them to understand some of the most important diseases we face. So cancer, for example. Cancer, this is a picture of breast cancer cells. And here is a curve showing you the death rate from breast cancer in the United States. It has a certain striking look. In other words, breast cancer, the chances of getting breast cancer go up as women get older. So why would that be? I mean, if it only takes a few mutations for a cell to turn cancerous, why would that happen? In fact, we all get cancer every day. We develop a few precancerous cells with mutations that could ultimately lead to a tumor every day. But it's not until we get older that we start getting more likely to suffer from cancer. So one of the reasons for this is how our bodies fight cancer. And I'm just going to take you through one of the ways that we do it. So let's say there's some DNA damage. It could be from being out in the sun. It could be being exposed to a chemical. It could be some random event. Let's say that a cell is starting to grow too fast. Well, there are actually kind of gatekeeper proteins in all your cells. And they're checking things out and making sure that things don't get out of control. And there's one, for example, called a gene called P53 that switches on a whole pathway of genes and proteins. And if it seems that the cell is really out of control, something happens. The cell either kind of slows down and goes into what's called senescence, and in fact it gets old, or it commits suicide. So that's great. You have stopped cancer. So you're fine. That cell is not going to be turning into a tumor. Unfortunately, this is not a perfect solution. Evolution does not deal in perfect solutions. So there are side effects to this P53 repair. When these cells kill themselves, or even when they go into what's called senescence, they spill out all sorts of molecules that can be quite toxic to their neighbors. And it can cause tissue damage. The stem cells that regenerate your tissues, even through your life, they lose their ability to regenerate. You get kind of long-term inflammation. You can even get DNA damage. And all of this has consequences. It can lead to a lot of the symptoms of aging, and it can even, believe it or not, lead to cancer. It's just not happening right away. It accumulates. So it's possible that the reason we don't tend not to get cancer when we're young is because our bodies are delaying the inevitable. They're delaying cancer until we're older. So we're basically have a short-term solution. And that's fine for natural selection, because natural selection, doesn't really care about how we feel in our own health. Natural selection just works on how it is that genes get passed on from one generation to the next. So if you're old and you're done, you've had your kid and so on, natural selection is really not your friend. Now, sadly, as I mentioned, Williams passed away last year, and he suffered from dementia. There really is quite a sad irony here that there has been a lot of recent research looking at the effects of antagonistic pleiotropy in the brain. There is a gene called ApoE, and there's a variant of it called ApoE4. You may have heard about it. It's been tied to Alzheimer's disease. ApoE4 turns out to be a very interesting, kind of puzzling gene. It really has two faces. So believe it or not, if you have this gene variant, when you're young, it's actually pretty cool. It's been associated with infection resistance, with doing a better job of recalling memories, and even for enhanced learning. So when you're young, ApoE4 is it's a pretty good gene variant to have. Unfortunately, it also comes with a cost later in life. And this is really, the heart and soul of antagonistic pleiotropy, the idea that Williams was championing, that I was telling you about before. Well, what can we do with this sort of knowledge? One thing that evolutionary medicine is good for is to inform the research that people do on potential cures. So for example, the germ theory of disease did not immediately lead to antibiotics and those sorts of cures. But it certainly helped to know why it was that people were getting sick from things like dysentery. You knew what your target was, and if you knew something about these germs behind the germ theory of disease, you could figure out ways to fight them. So evolutionary medicine is really helpful in terms of giving us an idea of what we're really up against. We're not just up against the disease that shows up late in life. We're up against a whole history of evolution that's had lots of different effects on our bodies. So maybe you have heard recently about a lot of the really exciting research going on into trying to reverse or slow the process of aging. Maybe we can actually, if not turn back the clock, at least slow it down a bit. And there's been a lot of research in this area, a lot of real legitimate, exciting research that's actually revealing a lot simply about how it is that we get old. So for example, there are worms called C. elegans, little tiny worms, but they're great for studying things like longevity, because they don't live very long, and how long they live is determined by their genes, and we actually share a lot of genes with these guys. And so a lot of important insights into human biology came out of studying C. elegans. Well, a few years ago, scientists were looking at a particular gene called DAF2, which is involved in sort of signaling growth and other things in our cells. And so some scientists said, well, let's just see what happens if we shut this gene down. Let's just check out what happens. Well, it turned out that these worms lived longer. And this was not like those Sapelo Island opossums, who lived 20% longer. These worms lived twice as long. So, we have DAF2 genes. So what would happen if we could somehow shut them down or trigger the same effect? I mean, could we live to be 160? Could we live forever? Well, these are exciting possibilities, but you have to bear in mind antagonistic pleiotropy. So this might be a gene this DAF2 gene might be a gene that makes you, when it's working, it might make you live shorter. So maybe it's not so good for when you're old. But genes that are not so good for you when you're old, as George Williams told us, can be good for you when you're young. And so some scientists who were thinking in terms of George Williams' idea said, these worms, are there some hidden side effects here? And they discovered, yes, that there are some. So these worms actually have fewer offspring, and there are a number of other side effects that they have. So before you go and take that DAF2 pill, just think about it. Do you want to live for a really long time and have a really lousy youth? That's a serious question to ask, and it's the kind of question. That George Williams was able to help us ask. It's not a question that Charles Darwin would have asked, but I think that if he had heard it, he would have been very curious to find out what the answer is. So, thank you so much, and do you have some questions?